Go. Hi, and welcome to the PRCA Fuse podcast, hosted by me, Adrian Ma. And this is a podcast in which I speak every fortnight to trailblazers in and around our industry. Our special guest today is Professor Anamik Saha from the University of Leeds. And Anamik and I actually studied together in the mid-90s at Goldsmiths. His specialist then, and remains to be today, is race and its relationship to the media. In this episode, we had a really interesting conversation about his experience of being an Asian kid growing up in the 90s. An incredible episode in which he was targeted by Black Twitter for posting a tweet about the musician Prince and what he learned about that. The problem with super diversity and its relationship to racial intolerance, and obviously, of course, the role that PR and comms professionals can play in shaping social cohesion in race relations. We hope you enjoy it. Hello, and welcome to the PRCA Fuse podcast for stories behind people with a passion for communications, hosted by me, Adrian Ma, speaking every fortnight to trailblazers in and around our industry. And this episode, we're joined by the very special Professor Anamik Saha. And full disclosure, Oni and I studied together in the mid-90s at Goldsmiths College many, many moons ago, and has remained a close friend ever since. And Oni is a professor who specialises in looking at the media and race. Oni, you'll do a better job explaining what you do better than I am. Can you explain to our listeners a bit about what you do?
Yeah. Well, firstly, thanks so much for having me on, Adrian. It's great to be here, and I'm looking forward to our discussion. Yeah. So I'm a professor in race and media at the University of Leeds, and my particular interests, going back to our Goldsmiths days, actually, Adrian, was like looking at I was very interested in the representation of kind of racial, ethnic minorities in media, and increasingly my research kind of started turning away from the representation on screen to their experiences behind the camera, if you like. So looking at the experience of people, from racialized backgrounds who work inside media, creative and culture industries. That meant I also encountered a lot of people who work in like PR and advertising as well. And in very recent times, I've been thinking a lot about diversity. Obviously, this is like the dominant like framing, I guess, for how racial inequalities and other types of inequalities are addressed inside creative and cultural industries, like the creative economy, whatever you want to call it. And so I'm kind of interested in what diversity is doing, if you like, the way in which it has or indeed hasn't provided opportunities from people from marginalized backgrounds, and how this is translated in the content we consume. And that can be anything from like popular culture to news, but also that includes promotional culture, and adverts and PR and, the stuff we encounter on a daily basis on our social media feeds.
Just
That kind of, there's a blurring, isn't there, between like, especially on social media, between like what we might have historically called entertainment and what we've historically called adverts. These things have kind of blurred, quite a lot in social media. So those are the kind of things that I'm interested in. Yeah.
And just to break it down then, so the work originally looked at what was shown to audiences, started to look at what was going on behind the camera a bit more and how that's all set up. And I guess that's with a view to whatever we're exposed to culturally
Yeah.
shapes what we are as a society and the relationships we have as a society, right?
Yeah, no, my big hook, and this is why I'm so passionate about media in particular, is that media is the space where, pretty crappy, reductive, if I can use the academic terms, racial ideologies are
Yeah.
reinforced and spread in media. Think about the way in which migrants, for instance, are represented in the news in
Yeah,
really
go.
dehumanized ways. Um, but also, it's the space where those racist ideologies can be challenged. And I find this especially in popular culture. Um, and so it's kind of funny because one of the things I've had to take seriously as an academic, you kind of generally critique, right? And you call out kind of what we consider, I don't know, harmful, ideological, damaging effects upon society, but also, what and media's role in that. But also, as you know, I consume a hell of a lot of media. I watch a lot of films. I watch a lot of TV. Sometimes I read books when I can find the time and the energy, listen to a lot of podcasts. And there's a reason why, because I've found stuff that actually resonates with me in some ways. A lot of the times it's nothing to do with race whatsoever, but some of the time it is. And actually that can, you know, that can bring me joy, that can bring me pleasure, that can also make me think differently about the world we live in. It might provide new insights, which I've never thought about. So media has that power too. And that's why, personally, I care so much about it. And I think most people also share that sentiment, but maybe they don't really think about it in those terms. But I think certainly the people who are tuning into this podcast right now, they're definitely engaged with these issues. So, and they
I hope so.
definitely understand, yeah, understand media and what role it plays in that way. So, yeah.
And I guess on that basis, we saw how this can play out in quite stark. Quite stark contrast, quite starkly last summer when the race riots happened. Right, so there was a trigger moment. There was this the spreading of misinformation on social media, and then there was the media reporting on top of that as well. When we spoke before, you talk a lot about how the current race relations, there's a bit of a crisis going on
Mm,
here, a bit of a crisis of diversity. I'd love to hear your
yeah.
view where you think we sit right now.
Yeah. How we live with difference, how we live with people who are different to ourselves, who we consider different to ourselves, or who we've been taught are different to ourselves, is like the perennial issue in Western societies. Right. And there's a very famous Black American sociologist who's writing at the turn of the 20th century, literally 1901, and he's saying like the color line is like the big issue of our time, the color line, and he's talking about race relations in America, and that remains the case like 100 and so years later. How we live with difference, how we can better live with difference, why we struggle to live with difference, these are the real issues. And I think, and Black Lives Matter was a really important pivotal moment because it kind of forced Western societies in particular, but let's not forget it went global, right? It went beyond the West. And that was the magnitude of this moment. It kind of produced this racial reckoning. So society that was kind of realized that actually it couldn't bury these issues under the carpet. The fact that America had elected a black president didn't mean that America had overcome racism, right? It kind of forced this reckoning. And in doing so, you kind of get this diversity turn that happens. Well, it was kind of happening before then, before certainly the protests in 2020. But for the last 10 years, it's been percolating, and then it kind of blows up at this moment. And a lot of the people, and again, many of the people who are listening to this podcast who've been in the industry for a while, will remember that that was a really pivotal moment, and it really shone the light on everyone, not least people who are producing culture, right, and content. That people and media that that become a ubiquitous present in our lives. So you kind of get this. Um, it's almost like this turbocharge in the way in which people of color become a ubiquitous presence in content, right? It was happening for a while, um, but but then it kind of exploded, right? I call it super diversity. I think we went from diversity to super diversity, and there's a very academic rationale for that concept, which I won't bore your listeners with. But it's crucial because it suggests that we've seen it's not unusual to see black, brown, Asian people in media, right? In fact, it would be highly unusual if we tuned into a new Netflix or produced or Amazon Prime or Disney X produced production which didn't have a person of color in it. It would be shocking unless that story, is literally, intended as a historical documentary of a specific time which had no people of color in that particular context, whatever.
But even in those cases, when you're looking at like Bridgerton and stuff, you're
Yeah,
seeing
you know what I mean. Yeah, I mean, I was thinking of Zone of Interest. Remember that film from last year?
yeah, zone of
Uh,
interest. It's brilliant. Yeah,
yeah, I do laugh. I kind of just the thought entered if they had, obviously that film about, that Nazi family who lived outside of Auschwitz. I did kind of imagine. Sorry, this is a very serious subject matter, but I did imagine a diversity call. Wanted actors to play Nazi family. We encourage people from all backgrounds to apply for this role. But it kind of got. Do you remember, 10 years ago, the idea of there being a black James Bond was like, whoa, can we? Should we? Is that right?
yeah.
And now it'd be totally normal. We've got Black Doctor Who. We've kind of
Yeah.
super diversity. This is the concept, right? Is important because it speaks to the hyper visibility of people of color now. But the thing is that while we see lots of black, brown, and Asian people on our screens, to what extent are we actually learning about black, brown, and Asian experiences? To what extent does that representation, is that just a superficial veneer that, and that actually kind of might make us feel good about the media consuming, but we're not actually having to really interrogate ourselves and our own attitudes to racial difference. And so for me, what's really interesting is that you've got this super diversity, but then also you get the rise of the far right in a way that Adrian, me and you, we experienced this back in the early 90s. That was the last time I was like really kind of scared about going out in the streets, and seeing all that happen and having a couple of encounters in that summer where I was like, brought back emotions and feelings which I hadn't felt for a very, very long time. And I'm sure you can relate to that as well. So that feels like a really mad contradiction or paradox, right? Crazy diverse, super diversity on our screens, rise of the far right, obviously Trump and so on in America. And actually, I'm going to suggest that those two work together, because the super diversity we see on our screens, I think, has produced a complacency.
But
So that was a
but
very long-winded way of saying that I think society got complacent about its own relationship to multiculturalism. Oh, we watch Bridgerton, there's black people in it. We're cool with that. But to what extent are we actually really understanding the experiences of black people in society and the daily kind of forms of racism that they encounter, whether it's from the police, whether it's in schools, whether it's in their workplaces, to what extent are we really learning about those things? And I think there's actually seeing, sorry, Adrian, this is a very long-winded answer, but quite frankly, black, brown, and Asian people, if you on that in our media, they're having a brilliant time. They're having an absolutely brilliant time. They're like, solving crimes. They're like superheroes. They're like, leaders of the free world. They're like raising families, but safely, no harms from the no, they're not victims of police brutality on our screens. In fact, they're often the police. They're never the criminals. If you go watch any cop show, black people, there's no black criminals. They're the cops. They're the detectives solving the crimes. So it's kind of like, well, and that, it's not that, and we can talk about this more. It's not that I want to see racism on our screen, all the time. That would do my head in. But I think maybe the balance has gone too
so
far the other way.
just to unpack that a little bit, then. So we're in this age of super diversity, as you call it. There's a lot going on. I think other people may think of it as a bit. Sorry about the noises in the background, by the way. Breaking to Anamik, I'm in the office and it sounds like a '90s hip hop record with sirens in the background. But I guess some people might call that tick box diversity as well. But are you saying that super diversity on its own is ineffective, but it could be effective, not even super diverse, but some diversity could be effective if we learn more about the experiences of these people of colour every day, and particularly the challenges that they face every day. That's the way to
Yeah.
come about. Is that right? Or is that what you're
Yeah, I
saying?
think at least, yeah. And as much as I'm really critical of super diversity, within that moment, there have been like really amazing, Adrian, as you know, like my interest specifically is in media and popular culture. And so there's been, plenty of examples of like within that kind of mediascape, right? That super diverse mediascape. There's some really exciting things happening, right? And, whether that's Steve McQueen doing his kind of small act series, whether that's Donald Glover doing Atlanta, Issa Rae before that doing what was that show that she did, Insecure, Michaela Cole, sorry, doing chewing gum and so on. So we kind of, and I think these are really, and they're really kind of radical. They kind of expose racism, sexism, and so on, but in a way that you don't feel like being smashed over the head. Feel sometimes it's playful, sometimes it's surreal. It's really interesting and artistic. And so in this moment, you kind of get examples where there's opportunities. Undeniably, there's opportunities now. It's not unusual to have a black showrunner now, right? As much as I might have my issues with Shonda, I hope that's not an issue for your listeners. But I have to put my hands up and say, well, this is, she's done remarkably well, right? And has done some really interesting work. And so there are these opportunities. And so, yeah, but I guess so. I guess maybe it is a balance. And maybe and yeah, so as much as I'm really critical, I'm like I gave this I was lucky enough to give my inaugural at the University of Leeds, which is like when you get promoted to professor, you do a big speech, right? And I did one called this was like October 2023 or 24, sorry, and it was called End Diversity. It was called End Diversity, and I'm making this really polemical argument about how diversity isn't cutting it in terms of fixing racial inequalities. This was an anti-racist critique of diversity rather than the Lawrence Fox style, tirade against wokeness.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then but then a year and a half later, Donald Trump saying exactly the same thing. I'm like having to like revise this argument, and that argument, that critique, that anti-racist critique of diversity, both literally and metaphorically, feels academic right now.
Yeah.
Feels academic right now. I don't really feel like there's a space to make that argument. But at the same time, what people are doing is that they're defending EDI or DEI, as they call it in the US. They're like, okay, we've got to defend it now. And I guess in that moment, I just want to speak to people and maybe discuss how can we fight back against that far right backlash, which definitely, in the context of what we do is really important. We play a key role in that, but in a way that doesn't slip back into that tick boxy version of diversity, which arguably is how we got into this mess in the first place.
Well, it's interesting because you identify Black Lives Matter as a key moment, a key cultural moment in which a lot of people started to become more aware of these issues. And I think at that time, and since then, we've seen a lot of corporates respond to those issues by posting stuff on social media when it comes to like Black History Month or even like Pride happening at the moment. What's your view on companies doing this?
Yeah. I mean, I don't deny that there's people in those organizations who have like really good intentions and want to show their support and maybe even belong to those communities that, are being marginalized, right? Um, let's talk about like, Black Lives Matter for a moment, because that moment in 2020, right, everyone did the Black Square thing. Corporations were like releasing statements. And Adrian, you know better than me, but I feel like 5 years previous, corporations would never ever align themselves to any kind of political movements, let alone social justice movements, right?
Yeah,
Would you agree
yeah.
with that? That was something you just kind of stay away from. It's not good for your brand. It can only get you into trouble. We don't want to show, we're aligned with a particular politics. So that was a really, really, really fascinating moment. At that time in 2020, I was doing this big research project on the publishing industry, right? And I was doing interviews with people who work inside like the big publishers as well as independents. And it was really fascinating to watch them kind of try and figure out how to respond. They knew they had to, but they didn't necessarily know how to. And often it was in that moment, and I saw firsthand examples of this where they turn to the one Black intern in that company, and go, "What do we do? Can you write? In fact, we're going to empower you to write our statement for us." Right? This kind of, and that poor intern who's like been there 2 weeks has to write this statement. I mean, obviously, it's more complicated than that. But I literally saw that kind of work being tasked on the few people of color. And for a moment, maybe that one Black intern did feel like empowered, but I spoke to them directly about this. They felt vulnerable and exposed. they felt exasperated. One, I being tasked to do this. Two, oh god, I better get this right, otherwise, it was a really horrendous kind of moment. And maybe that white CEO, manager, person, managing director had the best intentions. We want to do this right, but actually, what I found in that moment was it was driven by fear and guilt. That's what I found, and it was fear and guilt in that particular world, which is, research shows, the most kind of, let's just say, culturally homogenous, if you catch my drift, kind of
Yeah,
sector compared to
yeah,
all other kind of industries within the creative economy. It's definitely, the worst in terms of representation. Um, Otherwise, I think there were genuine efforts. I feel like, I wish I could give you some specific examples now, Adrian, of where I thought it was done well, but I'm not quite sure if I can. But I think there was.
what about Nike?
Say that again.
What about Nike?
With Copernic,
Yeah,
Colin
yeah,
Copernic. Did I say his name correctly, Adrian?
Colin
Copernic.
Kaepernick. Yeah,
Copernic.
Kaepernick.
So we're talking about the San Francisco 49ers quarterback who took a knee and was disciplined by the NFL for it, and I think banned.
Yeah, and Nike stood by
Nike
him.
stood by him, yeah. I mean, which is a really interesting moment in it. Interestingly, I feel like Nike is one of the only corporations who has the clout who can pull that off without it doing damage to its brands. And not least its very unique, distinct relationship with, very broadly conceived, the black community, whoever that might be, but certainly a black American community. They've they've taken on an iconic role within black popular culture. I think that's fair to say. So they could kind of get away with it. It's interesting because there's that other story from the US when Budweiser did
Bud
something
Light.
similar, right? And released Black Lives Matter statements, or at least kind of showed allegiance. Is that right? And
I'm
then
thinking,
sales dropped.
yeah.
And then sales dropped. Is that correct? Did they?
I don't know the ins and outs of that case. I mean, the one that I'm thinking of was the Bud Light case, where they worked with a trans influencer
Oh,
and
that's right.
to create some content, and they got a massive backlash
Yeah,
from customers as a
yeah.
result of it. Yeah.
Yeah. So isn't that interesting how like certain brands could do it? And Bud Light, that's like, even that's as brave to kind of work on like trans rights, which is still like, which remains, like tragically like such a kind of contested and controversial kind of issue, which is like, obviously from our perspective, agent really problematic. But nonetheless, in some ways that's too late. So like everyone was trying their best. So in like academia, like I've heard academics refer to it as woke washing. Um, Also, the concept of femvertising, like this was happening pre Black Lives Matter, where I think Dove are the most obvious example, right, of a brand that kind of jumps on these kind of feminist kind of movements, and so there's kind of, and they do it, and they've done it with varying degrees of success. I think you're right. I think Nike. I think that was, they stood up to the NFL. As much as I have lots of issues. I mean that's one of the things that these academics would say. The academic argument is that, okay, these forms of like woke washing, oh, like let's be generous, kind of a genuine investment in social justice issues, you know, kind of slightly disguises some very immoral work practices. The Nike have been accused, allegedly, of using, kind of very dubious forms of cheap labor, outside of the US, right, in order to make product that allows them to generate massive profits. So there's an argument there that this is the Copernican thing was totally disingenuous, where, you know, but
No, I
it's
think
interesting because I guess the issue though is where those social justice issues become seen as adding brand and reputational value.
yeah,
That's what happened, right?
completely. I
Good or
think,
bad, good or bad, that's what happened.
and
Um,
to be fair to Nike and to be fair to Dove as well, like the one thing that they have done is be consistent about it,
yeah,
which is where the issue with Bud Light lays. Like they tried it and then they rolled back very very quickly.
yeah,
with their cars without supporting the community and the people trying to push this agenda through on Bud Light.
yeah.
But I know from your own personal experience how this can be quite difficult to get right. Right? I mean, you told me this incredible story about what happened to you with Prince. Would, could you indulge our listeners in?
Oh God, Adrian. Oh yeah. So I've never spoken about this out in public before. So thank you for this opportunity. Well, I look like an absolute idiot. But it's really it is like I'm gonna recount this story. I'm gonna try and do it as quickly as possible, but I'm gonna try and make sense of it sociologically because I think it's a really
Okay,
interesting moment, right? And
thank
so
you.
when Prince, I am a massive fan of Prince. And when he died in was it 2017, 2018?
Can't
Can't
remember
remember
the
exactly.
yeah.
So I'm on Twitter then, right? And as is everyone else at that point. And, Twitter's when Prince dies, all these really beautiful kind of accounts of what Prince, meant, what he meant to people. What a genius he was, quite frankly. And I wanted to write something and I tweeted something a few days later. I wanted to think about it. And so I don't know if people watch, they'll be listening to his podcast, but in case you
There'll be
haven't
some
guessed,
video.
it's a listening pod. So if you can't see, I'm like a brown guy, right? Of Bangladeshi heritage. And so, and I wanted to recount this story of how like Prince, like in the 80s for Asian kids was like, took on this really, I mean, in a very different, but very particular iconic kind of status because, like Asian kids, you didn't see Asian people making pop music, right? We were totally invisible.
Yeah,
And therefore, like, some of us we didn't really align ourselves with a genre because there wasn't an Asian, apart from Bhangra maybe, but that wasn't for me. So like the Asian kids I knew were either into like heavy metal and rock or into like soul and R&B, right? And
yeah.
and at house parties, which was just like with Asian kids, it was only when Prince came on that everyone would hit the dance floor, right? Because Prince spoke to everyone. And I put out a series of tweets. The first one's really important because the first tweet said Prince meant a lot of different things to different people. But for an Asian growing up in the 80s, for a British Asian growing up, he meant a lot to me. And in this, over 3 tweets, I basically talked about how it was because of his racial ambiguity that we could pretend almost that he was one of us, right? So and I thought it was a very nuanced, really, take on this. I think your listeners can see where this is going. And then, I got a few likes. Maybe you liked it, Adrian, and that was fine. But then, like a few days later, very bizarrely, I'm in rural Warwickshire, right, visiting a mate who just moved into this beautiful old house and like rugby, right, and my phone starts buzzing. I'm like, what? And I look, and I've got this notification from Twitter saying I've been retweeted. I was like, oh, that's cool. The Prince quote, and because secretly it's like you kind of always hope that your brilliant genius tweet's going to be viral, right? So I was like, oh, cool. And I look at it, and it was like some kid saying, this guy saying that Prince isn't black or wasn't black, past tense. And I was like, what? That's not what it's. And then it starts, my phone's like buzzing, like literally bouncing off the table because it's been retweeted. And I look and it's this kid is like a black American kid, like a kid in the US, a black kid. And it's being tweeted by, so I don't know if your listeners know, but there's this phenomenon called Black Twitter, which refers to the kind of disproportionate number of black people who were at his peak, Twitter users, right? More than greater than their representation in American society as a whole. They were a real massive presence. And this tweet gets retweeted, and I'm like trying to write back, but as I write back, I'm getting like alert, like flooded, right? And I can't write back to all of them. So I'm like, okay, well, I'll release another tweet which clarifies what I meant. I'm not saying Prince isn't black. But then I was like, but they're not following me. They're not following me. So no one's going to read that. And so I close my account. I make it private. And then all of a sudden, it's the original poster is like, he's made as an act of celebration, he's closed his account, And I was like, kind of like I said, celebrating that they'd shut me down a bit. So I was like, nah, screw that. So I opened it up. And I just kind of let it roll. And I just couldn't. There was just no way of responding to it, right? And then so I go to bed. It's cool going. Wake up in the morning. It's quiet. I'm like, oh, thank God for that. 1 o'clock. America comes back online. It comes back online. My phone's buzzing again. And I was like, oh, for goodness sake. And I just have to let it roll, right? And so it goes on for 3 days. 3 days. This guy says that Prince wasn't black. And they're all like, kind of, yeah. And this is what's interesting, because actually, as much as I was deeply hurt, it was really embarrassing. It was really humbling.
Yeah.
But
Can I?
actually, what I saw was that it didn't become, it wasn't about me anymore. They didn't know who I was. I'm not like a celebrity. I had like maybe 1,500 followers at that point, right? So I wasn't really that significant in any way to this day. But it became about them kind of forming community, I guess. It was a kind of, and okay, maybe this is being a bit too generous, because in the end I was misconstrued. But ultimately, it just became about, I learned how these kind of issues become ways in which communities come together and form bonds, actually. And so it became, even though they were calling me out for misrepresenting Prince, um, actually became more about them, about this particular community forming bonds and commonality and solidarity. And it was a shame. It was a shame it was at my expense. But
Yeah.
kind of, maybe that's a hyper generous reading. And
Well,
I'd love to have like clarified, but there wasn't the space for it. What does that mean? How might we apply that to the PR world? I mean, like, would I have changed those tweets? I mean, I think that over those 3 tweets, I thought it was nuanced. I didn't think I was. I don't think there was anything there that suggested. I mean, it's quite interesting because I didn't use any hashtags, and a friend of mine suggested that someone had did a deliberate search for Prince racially ambiguous, because this was something that was coming up in the commentary, right? In all those kind of think pieces in like the broadsheets, the kind of more smug types of analysis talked about Prince racial and also racial ambiguity, and also the ambiguity over his sexuality as well. And so maybe someone actually who had a bit of a kind of axe to grind kind of did a search. Well, who's saying this about Prince racial? Um, so so yeah, and then maybe that's like the negative effects of that kind of social media culture. But it just kind of shows how vexed those issues were, especially at that time. I think I could probably get away with tweeting that now, and I don't think it would get the same
do, do,
reaction
do
to it.
you do you think that the fact that it was split over 3 tweets made
Yeah,
it quite difficult? Because it's quite easy
yeah,
to take something out of context in that way, isn't it?
yeah. No, maybe. But I'm an academic. I can't write things within 140 characters. I need like my paragraphs are as long as my sentences are as long as a paragraph. It's like So yeah, I mean that's definitely a learning. I mean, I just think those kind of channels, if you're trying to make any kind of nuance point, I think that's that you're always going to have a really tough time. So how can you communicate those complex ideas in an accessible, bite-sized way, which is how people kind of consume their content, like literally on stories, kind of fast forward. So and so the challenge for anyone who are listening to this is how can you do that in that context. But also I think we need to give space to thinking about, well, this isn't really good for discourse, right?
Yeah.
Let's admit, let's be honest with ourselves, we're in a really shit moment, right? This is as worse as I can remember, certainly in the UK context politically, right? In terms of what might be further down the, I don't want to like make any assumptions about people's politics, who are listening to the podcast, but I'm going to lay it on the line. I think, 3 years time, if Farage comes in, will be what's happening in the US is going to be happening here. And so I think we need to think about, well, it's the fact that the channels we use are based on these kind of bite-sizey kind of forms, which don't allow for any kind of nuance and complexity. Is that the
Mm.
problem? Is that precisely the problem in terms of where public discourse has gone? And so, if we focus it back on the people listening to this podcast, are people who work in PR, how can you think about? Yeah, it's about trying to communicate better, but how can we also? I think the really brave practitioners who are listening to this, and I think the fact they're listening to this shows there is a courage there, something that they do want to change. How might you change the form itself?
Yeah. I
That would
mean,
allow for something more that can actually contribute to public discourse, by which I mean a way in which we can all talk together. This is what PR is like really important for. Is like building communication, right? And building community. And how can you do that in a way that is really meaningful and can really have an impact on the conversation, that allows complexity, that allows people to deliberate together and reach a consensus, where people are listening as well as speaking. That's I think that's a challenge for people in your industry right now. And I think you're the most important people actually in that role right now.
Well, it's kind of like a one-way street, though, isn't it? The fact that we've been traveling towards this world in which content is getting shorter and shorter and shorter. But I think you make a really interesting point earlier, because I remember when you first told me about this story, I thought you were amazing in actually talking about the fact that actually this is part of public discourse. And there's kind of two levels of this conversation, isn't there? Because there's a single piece of content on that single channel, but then there's the broader context, which is the broader conversation. And I think if brands or companies want to get involved in this kind of thing, they do need to be thinking on a macro level.
Yeah,
It can't just be a tweet. It needs to
yeah,
be a commitment across all channels, telling the same story and leading up to something where, as you say, there's a bit of space that shows an understanding and an empathy and sympathy with what people are going through, right?
yeah, yeah. No, exactly. Unfortunately, there wasn't that much empathy and sympathy for me. That particularly, yeah, and that is a challenge, and that what's scary for brands in particular is that they lose control at that point. So
Oh, absolutely. And they
and
have to be prepared for that.
yeah,
You know,
that's terrifying. And I think the brave brands and services, charities, whoever are working, using these kind of communication strategies are the ones who are kind of willing to open themselves up. Hey, I mean, Adrian, do you remember like in the olden days? Remember that old marketing adage, like all press is good press? Do you remember?
yeah.
I mean, that's no
I
longer
do.
the case right now. Like brands and like and companies are like petrified about reputational damage.
Oh,
I guess it
completely.
can have a real
Absolutely.
impact. And and obviously look at Telsa right now. That's like so. I think that's fair to say that reputation is everything. Um, but what a brand who can like forge authentic links to a community and can open themselves up in that way and can engage with the dialogue and not get defensive, who aren't could ignore the shareholders for a moment and really kind of commit to a message and stick by it. I think they're the ones who are gonna yeah. It's that authentic relationship with the community. That's the thing
Totally.
which I'm sure all of you are constantly thinking about and like trying to cultivate. But also I know that you're working on tiny budgets, ever shrinking budgets, with companies that have also who are also got their own kind of commercial challenges. So who's going to be brave enough to do that?
It's a balance, but I think your point about those authentic community engagements is absolutely way forward. When we speak to clients about this stuff, we talk about the fact that they need to have the receipts to show that they've invested in this properly. So whether that be about sustainability, whether that be about EDI or whatever, actually with Nike, before they launched that campaign with Colin Kaepernick, they had actually done a lot of work with black communities and supporting black businesses at a grassroots level before they did that. And that gives them the receipts, the
Yeah,
permission to say we've done it. The problem is where corporates try to do this with very little a veneer of those receipts or no investment into that before saying we support this. And
yeah,
that's where they come unstuck.
yeah.
Um,
No, absolutely. The I mean, so a bit personal, and Adrian, you know this all too well, but my wife. She works for Carhartt, and I think that's a disclaimer. She's my wife, so you can take this however you want. But I think that's a brand who have like really built authentic links with like subcultures and a
yeah,
lot of
yeah.
and really like black subcultures, and they have had this amazing longevity, right? We were wearing Carhartt in the '90s, right, and it's still kind of maintained, I think, credibility, a level of credibility and authenticity. which is based around these deep links with these communities, and they do lots of
Yes.
kind of investments. They do a lot of work supporting those subcultural communities. A lot of it doesn't necessarily get represented in their branding,
Yeah.
but it means that when they do, ultimately they sell fashion, right? And they manage to do that in a way that has given them this remarkable longevity. It's not a brand that comes in and out of fashion. They just always seem present, and I think that's because they've just built that really solid base. It's I think that's another example.
Totally, totally, and thank you for sharing that story with us. By the way, I really appreciate that. If there was one thing that you'd like our listeners as PR professionals to take away from this as a result of listening to this conversation, what would that be?
Right. I mean, if it's about, my own specific interests in diversity, I would say to you, like, whenever a brand kind of suggests, and I think, maybe this is actually going to be going into reverse now in terms of where the cultural wind is blowing. But anyone who wants to do diversity, who wants to do EDI and show their commitment for it, I just want to, make sure that it's not just being done for the sake of optics.
Yeah.
And I know optics is a word that probably a lot of your listeners have used in their own work and practice. And it becomes a shorthand way, doesn't it, of talking about, like, are we making sure that everyone's represented? But all too easily, it becomes this tick boxy thing, and it becomes this superficial engagement with, diversity. And you end up producing this super diversity that I'm so critical of, where racial difference becomes a veneer, something rather than something that we understand. So that notion of optics, I think, is quite a shorthand way of, like, thinking more deeply about these issues. So the next time you've encountered that word, or whether you use it or another kind of expression, an alternative of just thinking about diversity in that kind of tick boxy way. Um, I think if you start just interrogating that,
Right.
immediately you'll start engaging with, what do we actually want to communicate here? And why do you want to communicate in this way? Is there a good rationale for doing it in this way? If there's a rationale, which we all agree there should be, we want to make sure everyone's represented. How can we do this in a way that goes way deeper than just making sure that we've ticked off kind of different people on a diversity bingo card?
Yeah.
Is a metaphor I always use. So that's just one. Yeah, like, I think that's quite a simple one. Um, but I think immediately start thinking beyond, go beneath optics. I think that will immediately open up some really interesting conversations. I'd also want to tell you listeners that there's no right or wrong way to do this. There's no right or wrong way to include Black people, gay people, trans people, women, so on and so forth, disabled people. There's no right or wrong way to do it. But as long as you show your intentions are true and authentic, that you've done your work. It's not just enough to say, look, I really believe in trans rights, without actually understanding what trans rights are. I mean, so many of us, are like, of course we're anti-racist, but what does that actually mean? What are
Mm,
the obstacles, challenges that we need to focus on as anti-racists? It's not enough to say that you're those things. And so there's no right or wrong way to do it. But I think doing it with kind of good intentions, but also doing that work. And I'm sorry, but I know you're all overworked, under resourced. So this is where you have to go above and beyond, I'm afraid.
love it.
I had this, just one more anecdote, right? I had this, I got a phone call from a producer of a music video for quite a famous artist. And this artist in particular had got a bit of a backlash after their previous video, and they were still committed to doing this social justice kind of orientated work. Let's just say, I'm trying to keep it as ambiguous as possible. And
Okay.
this
Yeah.
producer called me up based on my credentials, saying, "Well, we want to do this. Can you tell us if we're doing it right?" Because they read. I don't think they knew me. I think they just typed in race, social justice, and they found me academic, And I spent the next like half an hour of this conversation saying, well, there's no right or wrong way of doing this. And I thought it was a good conversation, but in the end, they were like, I think they were totally frustrated that they weren't given that black or white answer. Sorry to use that language, but like quite literally about, well, yeah, this is fine. You won't have, yeah, this is great. You won't have any problems. Well, that's not how it works. That's not how culture works. You're never going to get that definitive, yeah, perfect, nailed it, ticked all the boxes. Because once, precisely as you say, Adrian, once you let it loose into the world, people are going to choose whatever meanings they make out of it, and you lose control at that point. So the tendency then is for brands to play it safe and not engage. But actually, I think the brands, the services, the charities, or whoever your clients are, the ones who can kind of put something out there and let it go, but have done it based on an authentic engagement with the community,
Yes.
one which they've built over a period of time, that relationship, I think then at least you're going to get the goodwill. To go back to my print story, look, if I was engaged, if I was part of that community, I could have said that, and maybe that would have produced a very different discussion.
Yeah.
Maybe they would have been really interested in hearing about the experience of a British Asian teenager growing up in the 80s, where I just saw no brown people. And the brown people I ever saw in media were terrorists or taxi drivers, right? Always played by Art Malik. you know? So maybe then, I'm not going to blame myself for not engaging more authentically, but that was, I'm not paid to do that. That's what I would, yeah, that's what I would say.
Yeah, I think that would mirror some of the advice that we would give as well as professionals in our industry as well. Thank you. If people wanted to find out more about your work or the books that you've written, where can they go?
Yeah. Oh God. I've got a LinkedIn. I was locked out of my LinkedIn for the last 8 months, but I've opened up again. And there, so I was locked out of my LinkedIn for the past 8 months, but I'm back on it. And actually, that's probably where I'm going to start sharing most of my latest work. I've got this Linktree thing. Is it a Linktree? Is that what it's called?
Yeah.
Yeah, I've got one of those. Just type in Professor Anamik Saha Linktree if you can spell my name. Good luck. And you'll see my latest work. And that has academic stuff, but it also has a lot of non-academic stuff. I've like really been like, other podcasts I've been on, some articles I've written, which for non-academic audiences. There's stuff there. Thanks for allowing me make the shameless plug.
Hey, no worries. And that's just to spell his name. It is Professor Anamik, Anamik, right?
Yeah.
Saha, Saha. Thank you for joining us, and have a great day.